Hello, hello. Welcome to the Global Citizen Therapy Podcast, the podcast for women of color who are daughters of immigrants to feel seen, heard, and validated. My name is Nancy Diaz, and I am a trauma-informed therapist, speaker, and your podcast host today. And now, let's jump into today's episode. Let's talk about Marianismo for a second. Have you heard of it before? How much do you know about it? Most of us have heard of machismo, but how familiar are we with the term that affects most of us as women of color who are daughters of immigrants, the term Marianismo? So Marianismo was actually coined in 1973 by Evelyn Stevens. It's been around for a while. It's actually defined by the American Psychological Association as, in many Latin American Hispanic cultures, an idealized traditional feminine gender role, which is characterized by submissiveness, selflessness, chastity, hyperfemininity, and acceptance of machismo in males. And although clearly derived from the traditional role of Virgin Mary, Marianismo is not to be confused with specific religious practices of the Roman Catholic Church. And so there you go. That is the definition in a nutshell. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be dissecting it a little bit because I think that Marianismo is something that definitely relates to sexuality, to the relationships that we have as daughters of immigrants, and to the way that we communicate and show up in the world. It affects our self-esteem. It's very related to trauma, including generational trauma and that kind of thing, and actually has very interesting rates of anxiety and depression, which we'll talk about a little bit more later in this episode. So yeah, let's dive into it. So this idea of Marianismo, right, is the idea that you have to be a virgin, right? It's this idea that you have to be a quote unquote good girl. And definitely in Latinx culture, I remember being told this repeatedly as a young girl: be good, be a good girl. Make sure that you close your legs when you're sitting down. Make sure that you do this and this, that you serve the men first. Make sure that you learn how to cook, how to clean, all of this in order to become a good wife, in order to become a good mother, right? And even the fact that I wasn't allowed to play with the Hot Wheels cars growing up, right? I needed to always be playing with dolls, with the baby dolls, right? And making sure that I learned those skills, right? And so this definition here by the APA is a great start, but we're going to dissect it more because just from a quick little research, stalking of what is actually Marianismo, who has been studying it, who's been researching it, I can tell you that there's a whole bunch of interesting conversations, interesting research being done around this. So one of the ones that I found really interesting is that it says that Marianismo has a lot to do with women becoming these spiritual leaders, which if you just hear that in itself, you might think, oh, well, that's not such a bad thing, right? That's kind of, it has a little bit to do with, the matriarch, right? And because when I saw that spiritual leader, I immediately thought, like, my mom is a spiritual leader because out of everyone in the family, she's the most religious, right? And so she is the leader, the spiritual leader in our family, right? The one who gets us together, who before a meal will pray before the meal, that kind of thing, and will get us together to celebrate, not just the birth of Jesus, but other things that are happening, within the Roman Catholic Church. She's the one that goes to Bible study, all these things, right? So she is the spiritual leader. One thing that I've only realized, in the past few years since starting therapy is that she's also a matriarch, right? And very interesting because in the Latino culture, we have, of course, patriarchy, and we have, patriarchs because this is the thing, right? There's machismo, which is definitely very prevalent still within the culture, which makes us think that no, men have more power, right? And so you would just kind of think like, no, men. And so looking at family dynamics is really important and can really help us begin to understand how things work and why we might be feeling the way that we do, behaving the way that we do. All of this is related, right? So for me, realizing that, oh my God, even though my dad is the breadwinner and he's always been the only one who's worked and has, definitely we grew up, fearing him, like, oh, you better wait until your dad gets home, then you're really gonna get it, right? All these things. And still I was like, but my mom is the one that makes decisions. And so having this realization of like, oh, we actually have a matriarch, that was very interesting, a very interesting shift. And I was actually looking to see if anyone has kind of done research or is talking about this, the matriarchs in the Latino culture as well, and how that is related to them being spiritual leaders. But there aren't conversations about that yet. But I will leave you with that as food for thought, that this is something that I know I have seen in my family, and I know that is definitely related to Marianismo, right? I know that the idea that my mom has of, being a good Catholic woman is definitely, spreading the word of God. And with that means being a leader, means being, a good woman who is submissive, who is selfless, someone who has waited until marriage, someone who expresses passivity, and in the bedroom. And so that's a part of Marianismo as well, right? Is expressing that self-control, right? There's also, and I've heard this within the Latinx community. My mom is just so anti talking about sex and anything related to women's bodies or menstruation or bras, or she had to whisper the word bra, when we were growing up. And so all these things. So my mom very extreme on will not talk about that at all. What I've heard from people, who've grown up within the Latino culture with mothers who maybe talk about it a bit more, is that if they talk about it at all and they explain, what's supposed to happen when you do get married, when you do have sex, that kind of thing, they say you're supposed to close your eyes and open your legs and just wait until it's over, right? And I've read books where, yeah, this is definitely the narrative, right? And this is all you're told. You have no idea if you're supposed to bleed, if it's supposed to be painful, if you're supposed to enjoy it. You just have no idea, but you're just told that you just do what the man wants, and you're supposed to just be submissive and do anything that he wants to give him pleasure, right? So, but yes, there's also this idea, right? And same as with, Virgin Mary, and of course, the miraculous birth, without having had sex, is that you're supposed to be, as pure as possible, and that sex is something that is shameful, right? And so you talk about none of this. You're not supposed to talk about it with friends, with family members. It's something that's supposed to be kept very quiet and is supposed to be between a man and a woman in the bedroom and after marriage, right? And so there is the taboo of dating. And this is a running joke now in the Latino community, that you're not allowed to date when you're in high school, when you're a teenager, you're not allowed to date while you're in college, but all of a sudden you're supposed to be married and have kids and by a certain age, because you're not getting any younger, right? And you're going to be damaged goods if you don't get married by a certain age. So yes, and I see this across cultures as well, and across religions, and whether a family is religious or not. Again, I, as a therapist, work with women of color who are daughters of immigrants who are from all different cultural backgrounds and are located all over the world. And this is a theme that I see, is this Marianismo, right? This thought that sex is shameful, that sex is something that is so taboo. And yeah, all of these beliefs, right? That women should be submissive, that women have their role, their place, and that they should do anything that the man wants, that they are there to provide children and to please the man, right? So that is definitely one thing that I have noticed across religions and across cultures, and it is very interesting. And I will do another episode, so stay tuned. I'm going to do one all about religion and sexuality, and we'll go into kind of more on across religions, what that has to do with sexuality. But yes, birth control is another one that is very taboo within a lot of cultures. Birth control, and of course, a way of controlling birth is abortion as well. So very interesting that, there are some churches that will say no, we condemn abortion, and there are some that are more progressive and they'll say, no, we're not going to pray for the people that have had abortions. We're going to pray for the people that are on birth control. So that was my experience growing up, that sometimes if we woke up early enough on a Sunday, we'd go to one church where I remember specifically that we would pray for people that were getting abortions or had been getting abortions. And we would also pray for people on birth control, which is interesting because if you don't know this, birth control also includes the use of condoms, right? And we know that, yes, in a lot of Latino cultures, there used to be a lot of people having kids, big, big families. Now that has gone down, right? And so why is that? Because of the use of birth control. There's also been an increase in the number of people who are living with a partner, but without being married. And so, what does that mean? That's also a sin, right? And we'll get into that next. So, the sin of having multiple partners, the sin of having sex outside of marriage. And if we're talking about different religions, which we'll cover more in depth in the future episode, it's also, the sin of having sex with someone that you're not in a committed relationship with, right? So, casual dating, hookups, all of that is condemned and seen as a sin across a lot of different religions. So, yes, but going back to Marianismo, definitely something that you're not supposed to do, because otherwise you're not pure, you're not good, you're not someone that's deemed marriage material, right? And so, yeah, definitely having kids is a big part of that. And being self-sacrificing, that's a huge part of it as well. And so we see this with our moms, with our grandmothers, and it keeps going, right? Until someone decides to break the cycle, to challenge those gender roles, to advocate for themselves in the bedroom, to communicate their needs, to do something different, like experiment with their sexuality, their sexual orientation, potentially to experiment with casual dating or the hookup culture. All of this is about breaking cycles and female empowerment. And yet it can be so scary and so taboo, and definitely something that you should only experiment and try with the help and guidance of someone who understands these social norms that are within your culture, right? Because it can be really scary experimenting with all of this without being in the right headspace to be able to process all of this. So for me, having a therapist as I've been going on this journey, that has been really helpful. Someone who can help me understand, someone who's not going to shame or judge me for the exploring that I have been doing. That's been really important in my own healing journey. And so I will just kind of say this is all well and good if you are listening to this and you're thinking like, wow, I've fallen victim to this Marianismo, and I have thought all my life that I need to behave a certain way in order to be considered a good girl, and now a good woman, and a woman that people will want to marry and be with, because there is this stigma, right, around sex. And there is this thought that the more partners that you have, or if you're even, I mean, where does that leave ethical non-monogamy, right? If you decide that you want to be with more than one partner at once, where does that leave you? How do you feel about that? Exploring all of this in a safe space, exploring your sexual orientation, all of this, because all of this falls outside of this traditional role that you're supposed to follow of, I'm supposed to marry a man. I'm supposed to have kids. I'm supposed to give in to his needs. I'm supposed to accept and almost applaud the machismo. For example, if he gets into a bar fight with someone else because this other man looked at me, I'm supposed to accept, applaud that, be turned on by that. I'm supposed to want a man who gets jealous. I'm supposed to want a man who takes control. I'm supposed to want a man who doesn't ask me for permission for a kiss or for taking off your pants, that kind of thing. So all of this self-silencing, right? That's a big one with Marianismo as well, is that we put up with all of this, we silence ourselves, And that is actually where we see the higher rates of depression and anxiety. So there's a very interesting study that shows, and actually conducted with women in Costa Rica, that shows that there are higher rates of anxiety and depression with women who self-report to have values that fall into the Marianismo traditional roles. So yes, higher rates of anxiety and depression. And as we know, there are studies as well saying that daughters of immigrants experience higher rates of anxiety and depression than their immigrant parents. And of course, that's very layered, and that's kind of what we talk about on this podcast in all different ways, right? But yes, mental health is so important for us as daughters of immigrants. Taking care of our mental health is super important as daughters of immigrants, because there's so much that we are trying to do to break these cycles, to be mentally fit, to be mentally healthy. And there's just a lot that we are dealing with that maybe we have no idea how to navigate this, especially if we have been outside of that box in any way, shape, or form. Even if we don't like wearing dresses or makeup, or even wearing a purse. I mean, even that, my mom, used to shame me about that. Like, oh, you're just like a man. Why don't you ever want to carry a purse? Or why don't you want to wear dresses more? I don't understand. All these things, right? There's this idea that you have to be very feminine all the time, that you have to care about how you look. And same thing with body image, right? You have to look a certain way. And all of these values, I will just mention, brought into Latin America by Spanish colonizers, right? And so very interesting that we now have this idea of what exactly it means to be a good woman, to be a good girl. And we've been groomed to behave in this certain way. And that might be why we now experience so much shame when it comes to expressing our needs in the bedroom, when it comes to talking about sex with friends, even with family members, when it comes to being on birth control. I know that I struggled with this for so long. The guilt was eating me alive that I was on birth control. I felt like I couldn't talk to anyone about it. I didn't know if this was okay to talk with friends about. I knew that I couldn't talk to my mom about it. And I remember feeling very alone as I sat in the waiting room for hours at Planned Parenthood, waiting my turn to get birth control. But I just knew that I was terrified of getting pregnant. But I also knew that I felt like I was doing something wrong, something that was so taboo. And of course, think about that. What effect does all of this play? How does that affect your mental health? It plays a huge role on your mental health. So I will encourage you to just listen to this episode as many times as you need. Reflect, journal, think about how it is in your family. Think about the family dynamics. Think about how your mother behaves. Think about how your grandmother behaved around men, what conditioning you have been brought up with, and think about how that affects the way that you see sex, the way that you see relationships, how open you are with talking about these things, all of this. Because if you listen to the previous episode about how sex affects your mental health, it definitely does. It shows up in so many different ways, and they're very closely tied together, which is why I decided to make this whole season about sex, sexuality, and sexual health. I know that it threw a lot of people off to see that, but this is exactly why I wanted to do an episode on this, is because this directly relates to our mental health. We see that. I mean, just that study in itself showing that anxiety and depression are higher with women who fall into this Marianismo, these traditional roles. That's huge. So I will just encourage you to really explore this and how it relates to the way that we see the world. And I will leave it there for now. Thank you so much for listening and for tuning in. And as always, if you do want to have more support and more confidence in how you communicate about sex in the bedroom, how to communicate those boundaries, how to improve your self-esteem when it comes to talking about these things, you can download and take my free workshop, which is called Breaking Taboos, Communicating About Sex with Confidence as an Immigrant Daughter. So that link will be in the description of this episode. So make sure that if that's something, if any of this resonated with you, if you think like, wow, this sounds like me, I might not even be Latina or Hispanic, but this sounds like me. There are certain things that I have been self-sacrificing. I have not wanted to talk about sex. I have trouble communicating what it is that I want in the bedroom. I have trouble actually talking to my partner about certain things that I don't like or that cause me pain. I have trouble talking to my GP about this. This workshop, I did a free workshop with a sexologist where we talk about these things, where we talk about the cultural expectations. This workshop is custom tailored for immigrant daughters. So whether you're a daughter of immigrants, whether you're an immigrant woman yourself, or any of that, if any of this resonates you, highly encourage you to take that workshop. So I will leave it there for now, but my door is always open if you want to schedule a consultation call with me, see if we're a good fit for each other. But feel free to share this episode with anyone that you think that it could help as well. All right, take care. Bye. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed today's episode. As always, I am here to be open, honest, and vulnerable with you because you are not alone. If you want to support this podcast, please make sure to leave a review so others can find it as well. If you're interested in working with me, you can find me at www.globalcitizentherapy.com. And if you'd like to heal your relationship with self-care and learn more about how to find the type of soul care that works for you, you can find the link to my workshop in the description of this podcast episode. Thank you again, and see you next time.